Good afternoon. Nelson Mandela once said, "The greatest glory in living lies not in ever falling, but rising every time we fall." Now, what is he talking about here? He's talking about resilience, the ability to bounce back from hardships. And he certainly illustrated that. He spent 27 years in prison and then emerged to be South Africa's first black president. He illustrated also what psychologist Lawrence Calhoun calls post-traumatic growth. He became a better person in spite of his hardships. Now, while that's a worthy goal to aspire to, what's really most important is that we bounce back from adversity. And with that in mind, I'm going to cover 2 points. First of all, the nature and nurturing of resilience, and second, how we all can become more resilient. So first of all, let's take a look at the nature and nurturing of resilience. Humankind is innately resilient. According to the National Geographic website, Human Journey Migration Routes, between 60 to 70,000 years ago in Africa during the last ice age, we almost went extinct as a species. We were reduced to 10,000 individuals, but we didn't. We survived and thrived and moved out of Africa, willing to endure those journeys. And so too the Native Americans, the ancestors of them in about 20,000 years ago, crossed over from the old world to new world because of the sea levels had dropped. And look at the Vikings, Columbus, and those hardy souls that came over in the Mayflower and willing to endure those awful conditions in that ship to come to a new world. And then think about diseases. According to MiddleAges.net, between 1347 and 1352, it's estimated 25 million people died of the plague. And then according to virus.stanford.edu, during the 1918-1919 flu pandemic, it's estimated 20 to 40 million people died. And yet the survivors moved on. And then humankind has had to endure war. Think of the barbarians, the Crusades, Civil War, World Wars, devastating. And yet the survivors moved on. How we're nurtured growing up influences our resilience. On June 9th, 2014, Diane Sawyer interviewed Hillary Clinton. And Hillary Clinton said her mother was a role model for her resilience because of the hardships that she'd been through. And then psychologist Carol Dweck says that students that are praised for innate ability like intelligence are less resilient than those who are praised for their efforts. The difference between a fixed mindset that said abilities are innate and a growth mindset that says we can grow and develop skills. And then in my life, when I was 2, my parents picked us up, left the family fold in Ohio, hitched a ride on a little covered wagon going west to California, and apparently I helped build our house there. Now, I don't remember much, you understand, but it doesn't matter. The family lore comes down and infuses you with resilience. And then according to The Guardian, in a December 2014 article by David Cox, and the title of the article is "Unbroken: What Makes Some People More Resilient Than Others?" According to Stephen Southwick, who's a psychiatrist, he thinks that people who are risk takers and optimists are more resilient than people who don't have those attributes. And he thinks that these traits may be genetic, but he's not sure. There needs to be more research on that. He does make a comment on the helicopter moms and pops. He says they do not do their children any favors with their hovering. Now that we've taken a look at the nature and nurturing of resilience, let's take a look at how all of us can become more resilient. First of all, when we have adversity hit, we need to process it. And I'm a fan of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and her death and dying theory. And the stages that people go through is denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And this model has been applied to loss of a job, loss of a love. And the idea, of course, is to move through to acceptance. Unfortunately, a lot of people get stuck in the middle, in which case therapy is warranted. In 1983, there was a made-for-TV movie called Mad, the Candy Lightner story. And it describes Candy Lightner's struggle with losing a child to DWI. And she grieved for a long time, and finally a friend of hers came to her and said, Candy, you need to move on. And she said, I can't have had my child die in vain. And I'm sure that's what motivated her to start Mothers Against Drug Driving and also to lobby the legislature. It's important when we have adversity that we either find meaning or learn a lesson from it. And in my case, I had a job loss many years ago, and I was very devastated by it. And I got therapy, yes, and I started reading a lot about job loss. In fact, I got to the point where I knew so much I was going to go out and give a workshop. And by doing so, I finally was able to jump that last hurdle into wellness. Secondly, we need to have support, and we need to ask for help. In a Psychology Today article in August of 2014, there is an article adapted from a book called Super Survivors by David Feldman and Lee David Kravitz. And in it, they talk about a young woman named Amanda Wiggle. She was knocked unconscious by a boat, went into a coma, and was not expected to survive, but did. Had to learn to walk again and talk. But she attributes her survival to her mother and her fiancé. And according to psychologists Catherine Erbsdam and James Kulik, support can be crucial in life and death situations. But in other studies show, of course, it's helpful to all of us. And then let's consider the case of Jim Braddock, who was famous back in the day and will be forever immortalized in the movie Cinderella Man, starring Russell Crowe. Now, Jim Braddock was a boxer, had early success, then got injured, fell on hard times, and it was during the Depression. And he and his wife struggled to feed their family. But with grit and determination and the faith and support of his family and his manager, Joe Gould, he made a comeback. And in the fight of that era, he fought Max Bauer, who reportedly had killed 2 men in the ring. But Jim Braddock beat him. So it's important that we have support, and if we don't, look for support groups or find a therapist. And then thirdly, we need to comfort ourselves. And thanks to Erin Tarika, who runs a group in town, she gave me this idea for this toolkit. We all need to have a toolkit of things that comfort us during adversity. And I interviewed a number of people going through a loss or had gone through a loss. And I said, what helps you or what helped you? And I'll just give you some examples. Walking, car magazines, that was a guy. Meditating, dogs, one gal had 4 dogs. Reading, and music. Now, this is just a few examples. The lists were much longer. And I remember that the first night that I had chemotherapy when I had cancer, I wore a robe that I bought at Target. It was soft, sage green, and it really helped comfort me that first night. Sometimes little things do mean a lot. So, what is in your toolkit? And my next tip has to do with creativity. According to AmericanProfile.com, Danelle Unistead was a young woman that was legally blind and really had a lot of depression because of it. And then her father introduced her to adaptive snow skiing. That's where they wear the helmets and there they can communicate with each other. So she skied with him for several years and then met and married her husband and did the skiing with him. In fact, they got so good that they won the bronze medal at the 2010 Paralympic Winter Games in Vancouver. And then the next story, I love this. In Parade, November 2nd, 2014, we have the case of Carol Gardner going through a divorce, $1 million in debt. And her lawyer said, you either need a therapist or a dog. So Carol went out and got a dog, named her Zelda, entered a photo contest, dressed the dog up, won the contest, decided to start a line of greeting cards with Zelda in various outfits. And it took off, and she went to a trade show, and her business became very popular, and she added calendars, etc. And hopefully, Carol has made her $1 million back. Of According to psychologist Marie Forgard, quote, people who have openness to experience are more likely to have creative growth following trauma than those who don't. Now, my next tip has to do with take a productive risk. And I used to give keynote speeches on risk-taking. It's something that's dear and near to my heart. And here yet is another reason to take a risk. I don't know how many of you have seen Ken Burns' film, The Roosevelts, An Intimate History. Well, Teddy Roosevelt lost his wife and his mother. They both died within hours of each other. He was devastated. And what does he do? He picks up, goes west, becomes a rancher and a cowboy, and later on moves up back east, remarries, becomes president, of course, and his experiences out west help influence his conservation policy. And then in that book I cited earlier, Super Survivors, comes another example from that book. Asha Mevlana was a young woman who had cancer, recovered, and she took up violin lessons and then electric violin, and she picked up, moved to LA, quit her job, joined a band. And she said before she had the cancer, she would not even thought of taking such a risk. And then my father took a risk. He accepted a promotion in Canada and then later in France. And of course, we went with him, got to experience those cultures. And I think it planted the seeds that later bloomed in me as far as taking productive risks. So next time life hits you up the side of the head, well, think about taking that risk you've been thinking about. And then lastly, look outside of yourself and volunteer. Now initially, when adversity hits, the inclination is to go in and take care of yourself. And that's as it should be. But as you get healed, you need to look outside. And an example of this comes from Art Magazine. There's an article called Surviving the Jolt by Mark Miller. And I don't know if all of you remembered the Miracle on the Hudson, where the plane landed on the Hudson. Everyone survived. Now, the last person off that plane was a guy named Dave Sanderson. And he was so impacted by that experience that he quit his job. He now does fundraising and public speaking. And near home, we have a nonprofit called Paws and Stripes, started by Lindsay Stanek, and her husband is a Vietnam veteran, and he suffers from post-traumatic stress disorder, and he's been much helped by a service dog. So she decided to start a nonprofit that trains service dogs for veterans. And according to the Journal, in November 2013, Lindsay was honored as Outstanding Young Nonprofit Professional by the New Mexico Association of Fundraising Professionals. So whatever your passion is, whether it's dogs, whether it's children, whether it's a grassroots organization, get out and volunteer. And by volunteering and healing yourself, you make a contribution to your city, your state, and your country. And so, in summary, I've covered 2 points today concerning resilience, the nature and nurture of resilience, and secondly, how we all can become more resilient. And in summary, years ago, I worked as a volunteer on a suicide line in California. And before they put us online, we had extensive training. And during the training, they asked us all to consider what factors, what conditions would make us consider committing suicide. Well, I don't remember what I said. What is important, though, is that we build those resilient muscles so we can push back that moment where we might reach that level of desperation. We become like my little friend here, Bonzo the Clown. We take a hit, we bounce back, and perhaps in the process, we become a better person. Thank you for having me today.